Good morning once again. For today's video, I am going to discuss the different types of the fingerprint patterns. These fingerprint patterns includes the arches, the loop, and the whorl. Among the three patterns, arches is the least pattern since it covers only the 5% of the entire population. Then followed by the whorl pattern, which covers 30% of the population, whereas the loop pattern covers the highest percentage of the population, which is 65%. In other sources, loops covers 60 to 65%, and whorl patterns covers 30 to 35% of the population. For this video, I am going to discuss the whorl patterns. The whorl patterns, which consists or comprises the 30 to 35% of the whole population, has four types. So we have there the accidental, which covers 3%, and then followed by the double loop whorl, which is 13%, and then followed by the central pocket loop whorl, which is 14%. And majority among this type is the plain whorl, which covers 70%. A plain whorl consists of one or more ridges which makes a complete circuit with two deltas between which, when an imaginary line is drawn, at least one recurving ridge within the inner pattern area is cut or touched. In other words, when we talk about plain whorl, it must have two deltas. Another is it must have at least one circuiting ridge, which could either be circular or oval. And at least one circuiting ridge is touch or cross if an imaginary line is drawn from the left delta to the right delta. So these three are actually considered the elements of a plain whorl. So we are going to give examples on the different elements of a plain whorl one by one. So first element is it must have two deltas. Again, if you want to review about the different rules in locating the delta, watch the previous video on the analysis of different fingerprint characteristics and formation, because I have discussed the different rules in locating the delta. So in the whorl patterns, we have there the so-called the left delta and the right delta. So these are actually the two deltas of a whorl pattern. So in this example, this is the location of our delta. Our second element is that it must have at least one circuiting ridge, which is it could either be circular or oval. So in this example, we have there. However, of course, our circuiting ridge could either be spiral. Here, we have there spiral. We have there an oval. We have there a circular or any variant of a circle. And for our last element, for the plain whorl, at least one circuiting ridge is touch or cross if an imaginary line is drawn from the left delta to the right delta. Remember again that in plain whorl, there are three elements. Of course, it must have two deltas, a circuiting ridge, and that the circuiting ridge is touch or cross if an imaginary line is drawn from the left delta to the right delta. For you to easily memorize, you can consider these acronyms: 2D, 1C, 1T, or the 211 DCT, which stands for two deltas, one circuiting ridge, and one touch or cross circuiting ridge if an imaginary line is drawn from the left to the right delta. Our next type of the whorl pattern is we have there the central pocket loop whorl. This central pocket loop whorl consists of one or more ridges which makes a complete circuit with two deltas between which When an imaginary line is drawn, no recurving ridge within the inner pattern area is cut or touched. In other words, it is similar actually with the plane whorl. It must have two deltas. Second, it must have at least one circuiting ridge. And last, no circuiting ridge is touched or crossed if an imaginary line is drawn from the left delta to the right delta. So the distinction of the central pocket loop whorl in the plane whorl is the element number 3. If in plane whorl, there must be circuiting ridge that needs to be touched, in central pocket loop whorl, no circuiting ridge must be touched. On the first element, again, you need to consider the things or the rules in locating the delta, and this is applicable to the left and the right delta. On the second element is that it says there one circuiting ridge. This circuiting ridge is actually known as the recurving type. The second is an obstruction ridge at right angle to the line of flow. This is known as the obstruction type. In this figure, you can see the imaginary line. This imaginary line is actually the line of flow. It is determined by drawing an imaginary line between the inner delta and the center of the innermost recurving ridge. So if you look at it, this is the imaginary line. We have here the inner delta. Here is the inner delta. Here is the inner delta on the next illustration. And this is the inner delta on the last illustration. And this is the center of the innermost recurving ridge or the circuiting ridge. Another example on the obstruction type is that obstruction must be at the right angle to the line of flow in order to be a whorl, to be considered a whorl. So a recurve has priority over an obstruction. So this is again our inner line of flow. And if you're going to observe, it creates an angle. Therefore, this is considered as obstruction type of the central pocket loop whorl. On our last element of the central pocket loop whorl, there is no circuiting ridge is touched or crossed if an imaginary line is drawn from the left delta to the right delta. So if you are going to observe this circuiting ridge or this spiral ridge, when we draw an imaginary line between the left to the right delta, no circuiting is touched or crossed. In this example, under the central pocket loop whorl, you must consider that the circuiting ridge must not be touched or crossed if we draw an imaginary line between the two deltas. Again, in order to memorize the elements of the central pocket loop whorl, try to consider to memorize the acronym. The 2D, 1C, and the NT. 2D stands for two deltas, 1C stands for one circuiting ridge, and NT stands for no touch or cross circuiting ridge if we draw an imaginary line from the left to the right delta or between the two deltas. Moving on to our third type of the whorl pattern, as we have here the double loop whorl. So the elements include that it must have two deltas, two loop patterns, and these two loop patterns must have two distinct set of shoulders. So first element of the double loop whorl is again, it must have two deltas. Consider again the rules in locating the delta, as I have mentioned in my first video. Our second element is it must have two loop patterns or two recurving ridge. So we have here the first loop pattern and we have here the second loop pattern. And the last element of the double loop whorl is that it must have two distinct sets of shoulders. We are referring actually on the two loop patterns. These two loop patterns must have distinct set or separate set of shoulders. In other words, they do not share the same shoulder. In these examples, you can observe that the two loop patterns share the same shoulders. In this particular part, they share shoulder. Even on the second illustration, they share shoulders. The two loops share shoulders here. This is what we call the S-type. It forms like an S letter, and it is not considered double loop whorl. Under the rule, this will be considered as the plain whorl. Another example is this type. It is considered as the interlocking type. The two loop whorls interlock with one another. And this is also considered as a plain whorl. And last example is this, a loop within a loop. If you are going to observe this loop pattern, and this loop is within another loop. This is again considered a loop pattern and not a double loop pattern. Again, for you to be able to memorize easily the elements of a double loop whorl, you may consider these acronyms, the 2D, 2L, and the 2D. So 2D stands for 2 deltas, 2L for 2 loop patterns, and 2D for 2 distinct set of shoulders. Okay, so moving on our last fingerprint pattern to discuss is we have there the accidental whorl. This kind of fingerprint patterns actually includes any fingerprint patterns or combination of fingerprint patterns except for plain arch, wherein it must also have 2 or 3 deltas, and these are considered its elements. Under the elements, it says there it must have 2 or 3 deltas. If you are going to observe, this is the only pattern wherein it may acquire 3 deltas in one fingerprint pattern. So in here, in the illustration, these are the 3 deltas. Again, remember the rules in locating the delta. So second element or the last element of the accidental whorl is that there must be combination of the fingerprint pattern except, take note in this exemption, except the plain arch. So in this example, you can see there, we have there the first loop, first fingerprint pattern. Second fingerprint pattern is also a loop. And the last fingerprint pattern is again a loop. So this combination of 3 loop patterns are considered accidental whorl. Okay, so examples under the accidental whorl are the following. So on our first illustration or fingerprint pattern, we have there 3 deltas and 3 combinations of fingerprint patterns. If you are going to observe, this is a loop pattern. In the middle is a tented arch, and this third pattern is also a loop. And these are the 3 deltas. Now, on the second illustration, you can see there a tented arch and a loop pattern, combination of 2 fingerprint patterns, and we have there also the 2 deltas. In our last example or last illustration of fingerprint pattern, we have here combination of 2 fingerprint patterns. On the first fingerprint pattern, we have here a double loop pattern and another loop. And of course, these are the 3 deltas. So these are actually considered as accidental whorl. Again, memorize the acronym, or this accidental whorl is the very easy pattern to memorize the element. It must have 2 or 3 deltas, and there must be combinations of fingerprint patterns except the plain arch. This may be the very easy to memorize, but one of the most fingerprint patterns that are hard to identify. So I hope you must practice at home. Okay, so we are done discussing the different types of the whorl pattern, which includes the plain whorl, the central pocket loop whorl, the double loop whorl, and the accidental whorl. However, these 4 types of whorl pattern still needs to be categorized, whether this is an inner whorl, a meeting whorl, or an outer whorl. This will be discussed on the next slide. So, whorl tracings are only applicable to whorl patterns. In whorl tracing, we are going to identify whether this whorl pattern is an inner whorl, a meeting whorl, or an outer whorl. To begin with, our first step is the ridge tracing begins from the left delta to the right delta. Of course, before we proceed with the tracing, we must determine first the location of our deltas. So in tracing, we must trace from the left delta until to the point which is opposite to the right delta. Now, in cases that there are 3 or more deltas present, the tracing will still begin from the farthest left delta until to a point opposite to the farthest right delta if there are 3 or more deltas which are present in the fingerprint pattern. So if the delta is a bifurcation, take note. It says here, if the left delta is a bifurcation, use the lower branch of the bifurcation or the lower fork, and then continue tracing. Okay. However, if the left delta is a dot ridge, automatically you must drop to the next ridge. So if this is the left delta and it is a dot ridge, you need to drop on the next ridge and then continue tracing until you are near or in front the right delta. So in cases that you encounter this kind of ridges or formations, always use the outer ridges here or the lower branch, and if there is an abrupt ending or if the ridge being traced abruptly ended, you must drop to the next ridge. So drop to the next ridge and then proceed tracing until you are near or in front of the right delta. At this point, when tracing, you must stop on the point opposite to the right delta. So in this instance, the tracing must stop here since it is already in front of the right delta. And then count the ridges between the point, this last ridge, and the right delta. So take note that count only the intervening ridges between the ridge trace and the right delta. Take note, do not include the ridge hood and the right delta in counting, meaning in between this last ridge that was used in ridge tracing and the right delta must not be included. So in this example, we only have 2 that has been touched or crossed if we draw an imaginary line between the last ridge and the right delta. The result then of the ridge tracing is always interpreted as either inner meeting or outer whorl. So in this example, we have here the two deltas and we have here the ridge tracing. If you are going to observe, there is no abrupt ending and we stop in front the right delta. And then we are going to draw an imaginary line between the last ridge up to the right delta. Now we are going to count the intervening ridges between the last ridge and the right delta. In this particular example, we have 8 counts. And if we have 8, it will be classified or interpreted as an inner whorl. Why? Inner whorl must have 3 or more ridges intervening between the trace ridge and the right delta, which is, take note, in front of the right delta. So this is the front of the right delta. In our next example, or in this fingerprint pattern, these are the two deltas, and this is our tracing. Again, there is no abrupt ending, and we stop in front of the right delta. And then we are going to make an imaginary line between the last ridge and the right delta. So in this particular example, we have 2 intervening ridges. Now, since it has 2, we are going to interpret this as a meeting whorl. Why? Because when we talk about meeting whorl, it will be considered meeting whorl if it has less than 2 ridges intervening between the trace ridge and the right delta, wherein it is located either in front of the inner delta or the right delta, or near the right delta. And on our last example, we have here the 2 deltas and we have here our ridge tracing. Since this is a continuous ridge, however, it has 2 more branches, we are going to use the lower branch or the outer branch in tracing. Now we stop in this particular area since it is already near the right delta. In this particular example, we are going again to draw an imaginary line between the last ridge and the right delta. So in here, we have 3 intervening ridges. And if we have 3 intervening ridges near or on the side, take note, this is different from our first 2 example because it stops near or on the side of the right delta. Therefore, this will be interpreted as an outer whorl because an outer whorl is a 3 or more ridges intervening between the right delta and the ridge being traced, which are located near or on the side of the delta. So they are actually similar with inner whorl because they have 3 or more intervening ridges. The distinction between the inner and the outer whorl is that in inner, it must be in front of the right delta. Under the outer whorl, from the word outer, it must be located not in front of the right delta. Therefore, it is located near only or on the side of the delta. That's it. So thank you for watching our video lecture on fingerprint patterns.